The next update for Space Engineers 2 has been confirmed. Vertical Slice 2.3, the Drive, Automate and Detonate update, or the DAD update for short. As you can imagine from its name, it will be adding wheels to the game, a couple of automation blocks, and a couple of new weapons. And I'm pretty sure with the release of this update, we'll be at pretty much parity with Space Engineers 1's features, bar the addition of multiplayer. But we've had a recent update to the roadmap, and that instead of water being the next update for the game, Vertical Slice 4, NPCs and co-op multiplayer will be releasing in late 2026. We've seen a lot of progress recently on NPCs and additionally some major breakthroughs in water, so we'll be looking at that later in the video as well, so make sure to watch to the end to see that. So without further ado, let's start with Drive. For the past few months, we've been shown many teasers of wheels in Space Engineers 2, starting off with this wireframe demo you can see here, as rather than using the built-in friction physics from the Havoc physics engine that they use, they instead wanted to make it bespoke for Space Engineers, as the terrain your wheels will be driving over can vary a lot, with both things that you've built and also the default terrain of the ground. Whilst I know a lot of us are big fans of rovers in Space Engineers 1, they struggled a lot with the terrain in the game, and with the terrain in Space Engineers 2 being even bumpier, there was a big concern from a lot of players that using rovers would be quite difficult, but it seems they're going out of their way to make sure this won't be the case. Eventually we get to in-game examples where we can see the wheels driving over various different obstacles, and additionally how the wheels drive on different types of terrain. You can see this short clip here of this rover driving over the edge of a rock next to it. And I'm not quite sure if this is the case, but it appears that there is rotors in the middle of this grid, and that the wheels are functioning through the rotors. Perhaps we have subgrid control of wheels, which would be a big deal if true, but it's also possible that this is rolling on its own momentum, and there is not subgrid control. We'll have to wait and see, but personally I'm choosing to cope about this. With multiple different clips of rovers jumping over this bridge that you can see here, and they seem to quite successfully do it, regardless of the angle that the bridge is at. And also there is water under this bridge, very interesting. But it seems from this that wheels are much more robust in Space Engineers 2 than their Space Engineers 1 counterparts, and I personally cannot wait to build with wheels. Rovers aren't great, ships majorly outclass them in Space Engineers 1, but I just love building rovers. They're by far my favourite part of Space Engineers 1. Aside from all the other things I also say are my favourite parts of Space Engineers 1, mainly spinning things. Wait, wheels are spinning things! Da da da! I am personally hoping that at some point in Space Engineers 2's future, we do get central wheels, so we can make things like landing gear and bikes and stuff. But from what we've seen so far, I am very excited about the addition of wheels in Space Engineers 2. Right, the second letter, Automate. One of the main things we've been shown is the event controller, which you can see at the bottom here, and we also have the timer on the left and above here. The event controller was added quite late into Space Engineers development. It was added a couple of years back in the Automatons update, but it is probably one of the best recent additions to the game, giving you the ability to take what was previously only possible with scripts and convert that into a very simple block. The event controller has a bunch of events that it can detect, and then it can trigger actions based on those events, and those lists of events have been expanded greatly in Space Engineers 2. Previously these were simple things. One of the main things I used it for in Space Engineers 1 was it having the ability to detect when an inventory was filled. So when my mining ship was full, I would turn on a light or play a sound to indicate that it was full, or when my hydrogen tanks were getting low, I would use it to automatically turn off my hydrogen engines. As you can see in this image here, when the event controller is added to Space Engineers 2, they're going to add a bunch of new events that it can detect, with the new ones being highlighted here in yellow and green, with some of the more interesting ones being input move up and down, input move left and right, input move forward and backwards, and input yaw, pitch and roll. As with those, you can use the event controller to detect when you use movement controls, and you can use it to do things like this. Building a welding arm, as you can see in this example here, with it wangling around here. And you can see this is a similar example, but it has a landing gear on the end instead. And it's able to extend, it's able to move the foot up and down, it's able to rotate left and right, and this can all be controlled with WASD and Q and E to rotate, and additionally using your mouse to move up and down and left and right. We've also been shown an example of this being used to make a custom turret, something which was not possible in SE1 with the event controller alone. Parts of what this new version of the event controller can do were possible before, with stuff like scripts which I mentioned earlier, and you could achieve some of this using the custom turret controller, but this will make it so much easier in Space Engineers 2. They've also shown off a couple of other examples of the event controller. In this example, you can see that an event is triggering automatically when we reach different speeds. When the ship goes above 20 meters per second, the screen at the bottom starts flashing red and saying that safe speed is deactivated. This is because in Space Engineers 2, you don't take damage from collisions when you're moving slower than 20 meters per second. So in this instance, the event controller is being used to detect whether you would take damage if you hit something. And in this example here, we have another rover, and you can see using the event controller, they've created automatic braking and reversing lights. So presumably the braking lights activate when you either brake or press backwards on the controls to slow down, but the reversing lights only activate when you're actually going backwards, presumably using the velocity event on the event controller. And in this example here, it's being used to create a sort of probe, that when it gets near ore it detects it and then is able to tell you that it's found some. Once again, something that wasn't possible in Space Engineers 1. Because the event controller was added so late to Space Engineers 1, I wasn't sure it'd make its way to Space Engineers 2. So I'm very happy to see that it is being added to Space Engineers 2 so early, and additionally that it's getting massively improved compared to its Space Engineers 1 counterpart. Here is a brief example of the timer functioning in Space Engineers 2. You can see that the timers are slowly activating one at a time and changing the colour of this light. And again, speaking of features that were added late into Space Engineers 1 but are making their way early to Space Engineers 2, the ability to change the colour of a light with a timer or any other functional block was only recently added to Space Engineers 1 in the last year or so. So seeing this come to Space Engineers 2 so early in the development is something I'm very happy about as well. This feature was called Set and Execute, where in Space Engineers 1, you could press a button or a hotbar or any automation block, and then set a setting on a block to a specific value. And this feature affects light colors, and also things like setting a piston to a specific length or a rotor to a specific angle, and a bunch of other things. So I presume with this light color feature coming to Space Engineers 2, that the majority of these automation features will be in Space Engineers 2 going forward. Whilst the rotor and the piston were added in the last update for Space Engineers 2, the final mechanical block, the hinge, is going to be added in this next update, which will complete our suite of mechanical blocks in Space Engineers 2, and I'm sure mech builders and especially apologies will be very happy. And one thing I want to show is in the previous video showing off the hinge, they showed this ship here connecting to the end of this kind of like hinge and rotor arm, and then them activating the rotors on this arm and then flying around. And I know this might sound crazy, but as Todd Howard once said, it just works. There's not a clang in sight. The whole thing rotates, doesn't clang out, doesn't spin around. Well, it does spin around, but you know what I mean. All of the physics things just work. It's kind of magical the way it looks, especially with the ship flying so far away from the axis. I don't know guys, it feels like clang might be dead in Space Engineers 2, or at least subgrid clang anyway. In the hinge teaser, we also saw that buttons were coming to the game. These will be a big part of your automation, as you can use these to activate all kinds of different things like your hinges, your rotors, your event controllers and all stuff like that. And the final block I want to talk about in this automate section is the remote control block, which obviously allows you to remote control ships in Space Engineers 1, so I presume it will have the same function in Space Engineers 2. However, a rarely talked about feature of the remote control block in Space Engineers 1 was its ability to automatically pilot ships. It wasn't great, it didn't really work well at all, except for in space where there was nothing around. And the AI blocks added in the automatons update were obviously much better than the way the remote control block worked. But with no AI blocks in sight, it's possible that this block might be the only form of automated movement we have at the moment. And whilst this isn't confirmed, they have shown this example here of testing out collision avoidance, presumably for ships by this example. So hopefully when automated ships are added to Space Engineers 2, they'll be much better than the Space Engineers 1 counterparts, and additionally, maybe we'll get automated rovers too. Maybe NPCs will be piloting, who knows. So we've had Drive, we've had Automate, let's talk about Detonate. Whilst in the 2.2 update, the Gatling turret was added, the Vertical Slice 2.3 update is adding the rest of the base game weapons, the Warhead and the Rocket turret to the game. Now there is no sign of the rest of the Space Engineers 1 weapons that were added in the Warfare 2 update. However, we know they want to do a big overhaul of combat in Space Engineers 2 to make it much more engaging than the Space Engineers 1's combat, so I would assume there's going to be a big combat update in the future that will add the rest of those weapons, or perhaps an entirely new suite of weapons. We'll have to wait and see. For now, we have the small warhead and the large warhead, which you can see on screen, and just looking at the model of this, I'm hoping this spins somehow. It looks like it can spin. Maybe when the timer's going, it can spin around in the middle a little bit. That'd be pretty cool. Spins. And as you would expect, the warheads explode, and they do a considerable amount of damage. That was the small warhead, and this is the large warhead, which, as you can see, explodes at a much larger radius. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to are the little fractures that come off of the blocks. This is the new block fracturing feature in Space Engineers 2, which has been in the game since release, but it always looks amazing. And it makes destruction like this look so much better and more realistic than Space Engineers 1, and pretty much every other game as well. Warheads aren't going to be the only thing exploding in Space Engineers 2 though, as reactors that are on and filled with uranium will also now explode once they have taken sufficient damage. This is the small reactor exploding here, and it explodes around the same size as a small warhead it appears. Obviously this is all subject to change. And as with Space Engineers 1, containers with ammo in them also explode when they're damaged, and presumably this explosion will be larger the more ammo there is in this container, as it is in Space Engineers 1. And hydrogen tanks with hydrogen in them also explode, as also they do in Space Engineers 1. Again, the fractures here look amazing, just bits of ship flying off everywhere. Finally, there's this video here showing off different blocks exploding inside the big red ship, and showing off the explosion size of different blocks. I really like when the large hydrogen tank explodes, but the shell of the hydrogen tank is still there. That looks so good. And one of the big things to take away from this is whilst the large reactor has a big explosion, the hydrogen tank has a big explosion, the warhead definitely has the biggest explosion, you know, being a weapon, and it's able to cleave the big red ship almost in half. And again, the fractures look so good. Destruction on Space Engineers 2 is just on a whole different level. As the Space Engineers tagline is, destruction has never felt so good. Warheads also damage terrain, as you can see here, and my hope is that you can mod warheads to destroy a much bigger radius in Space Engineers 2, as there's some sort of cap on how far you can take it with modding, as I found in my Destroying a Planet video. So I'm hoping we can make this much bigger, and we can once again use a warhead to destroy an entire planet. Otherwise, I'll have to get very creative this time. As I said, rocket turrets are also making their way to the game, along with the static rocket launcher as well. And as the Space Engineers 1 rocket turret's biggest hater, I much prefer the design of the rocket turrets in Space Engineers 2. I don't know what it is about the Space Engineers 1 rocket turrets, but I just don't vibe with it. There's just something wrong with it, and I can't put my finger on it. But this looks so much better, so much beefier as a weapon. And one thing I really like is when these rocket turrets take damage, different parts of the turret fracture off. So the barrels, or the salvos I guess maybe, fracture off, leaving you with only one barrel, presumably not functional. But still, I love that in battle, different parts of your turrets could just be fracturing off and flying about everywhere. Battles in Space Engineers 2 are going to look so good. And we know that in the future there'll be improvements to this fracturing detail. Currently in Space Engineers 2, when you damage a block and fracture a piece off of it, it exposes this damage region underneath, and you can see it as this kind of twisted metal frame or scaffolding underneath. But in the future, fracturing is going to be updated to not only have the bits of metal frame underneath, but also different wires and different bits of technology. So rather than the inside of the blocks looking like a bunch of shrapnel bunched together, the blocks will instead have different components and wires inside of them to make it look like they have the bits inside of them to allow the blocks to actually function. You can see this example here of the side of the assembler taken off. And in my opinion, this looks much better than the different random shards of metal underneath. And to complete these set of combat blocks, we also have the decoy, which I presume will work like a Space Engineers 1 counterpart, and enemy weapons will be more likely to shoot this rather than the components around it. Perhaps with them suggesting a combat overhaul in Space Engineers 2, they might change the way the decoy works. They released a long dev diary in the past going over how they wanted to overhaul combat in Space Engineers 2 in order to overcome the issues with it in Space Engineers 1, so I would definitely suggest that some changes can be made to the decoy to achieve some of that. They've shown off a bunch of other blocks coming to Space Engineers 2 in this next update. And rather than go through all of them individually, I just want to mention that this is pretty much all the blocks in Space Engineers 1, so we're pretty much at parity with Space Engineers 1. We're going to have all the features in Space Engineers 1 combined with all the new features from Space Engineers 2 so far, as we know that water and NPCs are coming later. So when this update releases, it might be a good time for those of you that have been holding off to check out the game, as it will be pretty much a better version of Space Engineers 1 at that point. I know there are a couple of things that people don't like about Space Engineers 2. One is the target-based gyro, which is where you control the ship with your mouse, but there is already a feature in the game to turn that off, and you can go back to classic WASD controls. You can do this by going to any cockpit and then opening up the terminal, and you can see I have an option down here to toggle off target-based gyro. And now I'm using the old Space Engineers 1 style controls in order to move the ship around. People aren't a fan of the super dampeners, which is where your ship very quickly decelerates and slows down, but you can disable that in the world options. And whilst it's already released, in the 2.3 update, they're going to add the Classic Survival mode to the main menu, and Classic Survival is a modified version of Space Engineers 2 Survival, where, like Space Engineers 1, you can get resources by mining planetary voxels, so mining the ground on planets will give you iron, nickel and silicon, depending on the material that you mine, and additionally in Classic Survival, the backpack building is reduced down to pretty much only being able to build the smelter, the first crafting block in Space Engineers 2. So Classic Survival, as its name would suggest, is much more like Space Engineers 1 survival experience, where there is basically no backpack building other than the ability to build the first manufacturing block, which you'll then use to build the rest of the components you need to build a ship and stuff like that. So those of you that want a more classic or potentially more difficult Space Engineers experience, the Classic Survival mode might be what you want to check out when this update releases. Or alternatively, you can check it out now by downloading a mod. I'll leave a link how to do it in the description below. One block I want to highlight is the light panel, which sure, it just lights up, it's a panel, but as I'm a big fan of destruction, one of my favourite features they've shown off of this is that when you shoot different parts of the light panel, it cracks and only a section of it is damaged, and this looks so good. And one of my hopes is that LCDs are also coming in this update, and that LCDs will also crack like this when they're damaged, and perhaps the screens will glitch out a little. That'd be a really cool effect. Please, Keen, make it happen. Pretty please. I'm not super sure if it's coming in this next update or an update later on, but one thing they appear to be doing is overhauling the encounters in the game and adding a much larger variety of them. This doesn't really fit into Drive, Automate and Detonate, but there's also plenty of other blocks that appear to be coming in this update, so potentially this is coming along as well, and I really like how some of these bases look. This dome on part of the Savannah Mountain here looks so good. And another thing they're working on is improving the visuals of planets. In this screenshot here, you can see a before and after of adding snow to trees. It might seem like a small thing, but it does make a lot of sense. And additionally, they're adding a much larger variety of trees to the game, such as trees that look like birch, olive trees, more varieties of palm trees, poplar trees, which I've never heard of, which have got little mushrooms on them. And this will add a much greater variety of flora to the game. And also, one thing I want to mention, I don't know if this is anything, but these birch trees have these weird like blobs on them. And they have birch trees in the UK, and I don't recall them having these big orbs on them. Perhaps I need to go out and touch grass more, but is this a thing? Does anyone know what this is? Or are these like weird alien fauna birch trees? The orb. They're currently experimenting with adding wind to the game, but this isn't just going to be a visual thing. As you can see in this teaser here, when they artificially turn up the wind, it starts blowing the ships around. And also in this example, the player as well. Whee! It seems this will be more of a hazard on planets than a permanent fixture on planets, so put your ship sails away, and I would imagine that this will come into effect during storms and sandstorms that were added in the last updates, making those weather events more than just a visual effect, they actually have an impact on gameplay. They're also working on new grass clustering technology that makes grass look a bit more realistic, and you can see, yep, they definitely achieved that. It definitely looks a lot better in these screenshots. It's a bit more random in the current version of the game, and in these screenshots you can see that different types of grass are clustered together, creating an obviously much more natural looking effect. And my favourite batch of these planetary improvements is an overhaul to lighting. In the current version of Space Engineers 2, the lighting feels a bit flat. I especially noticed this when I'm creating thumbnails for the game, and I have to up the saturation a lot to kind of bring out those colour details. But as part of improving the visuals of planets, they're also updating the lighting, and it looks way better visually than before. The darker shadows, ironically, make it actually look brighter and more vivid, and it definitely takes away that flat feeling the game had before. Whilst most of the focus of the recent teasers for Space Engineers 2 have been the Drive, Automate and Detonate update, we've still been shown some very exciting advances for both NPCs, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, will be coming later this year in the NPC and co-op multiplayer update, and also Water, which despite being pushed back on the roadmap has still been making significant breakthroughs. The Vertical Slice 4 update will include the beginnings of multiplayer for up to 4 players in co-op, with full multiplayer coming later, and the same is the case for NPCs, where they are currently focusing on making NPCs able to move around and fight, and then once the foundations are in, they'll work on adding factions and adding characters and interacting with NPCs after that. The first few NPC teasers we were shown showed off some very basic features, such as the NPCs being summoned to the player and walking over, the NPCs following the player around, and additionally the NPCs patrolling around on a route. And as I said, these are quite basic features, but the key thing with them is that Space Engineers 2 is a sandbox game where you can build whatever you want, you can destroy whatever you want, you can make big holes in the terrain with warheads, bits of your ship can be blown off, and because the environments are so dynamic, NPCs need to be able to react dynamically to any environment they are placed in and any changes that are made to it. This is why one of the main focuses of the next update is the movement of NPCs, but as I also said, one of the other things they're focusing on is getting them able to fight. We've been shown that the NPCs have visual cones where they can walk around and detect things within their vision. Perhaps this means we'll be able to do stealth in the future, rather than NPCs being omniscient and knowing exactly where the player is at all times. They additionally respond to sound as well, so perhaps if they hear gunfire, they'll come running over and have a look. We've been shown a couple of different NPC behaviour types, one of them being that the NPCs will run and hide. Presumably this is for non-combat NPCs, like neutral NPCs at a station or something, that if you start shooting, they'll run away from you and hide somewhere. An additional behaviour that if they detect something, that they'll go and patrol the area in order to find out what it was. The number of Skyrim and Oblivion memes that are going to come out of this is going to be so good. Must have been the wind. Additionally, NPC targeting is going to be more complicated than just walking towards the player and shooting them, as they've added cover mechanics to the NPCs, where the NPCs will run to cover and hide behind it when they're not shooting. Obviously this is all work in progress and the NPCs are still quite basic at the moment, but there's just show a lot of promise with NPCs in Space Engineers 2, that they'll be more complex than just guys that stand there and shoot at you and run towards you, that they'll have more complex AI than just being a moving turret. So I look forward to seeing how they progress in the future. We know that there's a big faction system coming with NPCs in Space Engineers 2. We've been showing lots of different NPCs from different factions, and different unique named NPCs coming to Space Engineers 2. So it seems like a lot of effort will be going into making NPCs in Space Engineers 2 really cool, and much deserving of the 2 in Space Engineers 2. As I said, there's been some big breakthroughs in water recently. However, let's not forget that there is also water planets coming alongside water. We've received some new screenshots recently of our water planet Byblos, focusing on some of the volcanic coastline, which is looking really good. I really like how they've managed to separate Byblos visually from being just another Earth planet, and instead it's got its own visual identity, with the large volcanic-y Iceland-like areas, the large expansive polar regions that we've seen as well, which still manage to look different from the polar regions of Virga, the Earth-like planet. And also these large volcanic mossy regions as well, just look so alien compared to anything else in Space Engineers 2. And all of this on top of primarily being a water planet, with mostly oceans covering its surface. It's a shame we're only getting 3 planets in base Space Engineers 2, as one of the planets is an Earth-like planet, which is, similar to Earth. The second one is a Mars-like planet, so similar to Mars. And the third one legitimately has some sort of alien-looking regions, even if they're based on Earth locations. But I just think it's a little bit of a shame that these are the only alien-like environments that we're getting, and everything else just feels a bit too familiar. Alien Planet 2 perhaps in the future? In this clip here, we can see a wall made of 25cm blocks, the smallest block type in Space Engineers 2, and they remove a gap in this wall, and you can see that water comes flowing through the gap. So one thing that's important to note about this teaser is that the simulation of water and the visuals of water don't 100% match. So this teaser is demoing that the simulation of water is now complex enough that it is able to flow through the smallest gap that you're able to build, meaning the fidelity of the water is very high, but the visuals of that don't currently match that, as it appears a larger volume of water than the actual hole is flowing through the gap. And additionally, water appears outside the box, as you can see at the front of it, and then behind it, and then if you look at the wall, you can also see water is appearing up here, whereas on the simulation end it's not. However, since this teaser, we've also been shown some huge breakthroughs in the visual rendering of water. In the past, we've been shown many teasers of the submarine here, and they were showing the fact that whilst the water outside of the submarine was fully volumetric, that there was no water inside the submarine, which is obviously how it should work, and if they would break a hole in the side of the submarine, that the water would come flowing in. However, the thing to draw your attention to is that it doesn't perfectly line up. You can see there appears to be a kind of bubble around the submarine. It's much easier to see at the front, and it's very visible where the water actually stops and that it's not perfectly aligned to the walls and the windows of the submarine. However, in a recent teaser, they have shown that this is entirely fixed. On the left, you can see the submarine, and you can see what I was showing you before, where there's kind of like a bubble around the submarine, where the water isn't perfectly flush to the outside of it. However, on the right, you can see that it's perfectly fine. And just to prove that there is no water inside the submarine, they've also shared a screenshot of inside, and again you can see there's sort of this bubble around the front where the water is not perfectly aligned to the front of it, and on the right hand side, absolutely flawless. So the fidelity of the water simulation has been massively improved, and also the visuals of water have also been massively improved as well. Water in Space Engineers 2 is one of the things I'm most excited about, and genuinely every teaser shows it getting better and better and better. And while sadly we have to wait until next year to get our hands on the final version of it, it will definitely be worth the wait. As I said at the beginning of this video, the Drive, Automate and Detonate update will release at the end of June or the beginning of July, and then after that the NPC and multiplayer update will be releasing at the end of this year, with the water update moving to 2027. So if you want to keep up to date with any of those updates, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel to keep up to date. And if you want to go the extra mile and support this channel, you can do so by becoming a YouTube member or a patron with the links in the description below.